At the end of the recent chapter, we see that Sukuna has now used Mahoraga and Gojo begins to get a nosebleed. And I know that a lot of people have a couple questions about this. One of the main questions is, well, has Sukuna been using Mahoraga the entire fight? Or if Sukuna is pulling out Mahoraga for the first time right now? And if he is, then what will Mahoraga change about the fight? Will Mahoraga's abilities provide a drastic change in this fight? Or does Mahoraga not end up changing anything at all? Is Gojo so strong that even with Mahoraga in play, he's still going to fight at the same level? And I will also be covering the nosebleed that Gojo has at the end of the chapter. I know that some people think that this nosebleed is directly because of Mahoraga, and others think that this nosebleed is from the pressure that Gojo's been putting on himself, and I will get into all of that in today's video. So first, let's look at the question of whether or not Sukuna has been using Mahoraga since the beginning of the fight, or if he is just using Mahoraga right now. And I will say this, at first I was a bit conflicted, because the way in which Sukuna has just used Mahoraga is the wheel turning inside some shadow. It is very possible that Sukuna has just had this wheel hidden in the shadow the entire time, and he just never showed it to Gojo. But it is also possible that this is the first time Sukuna has used Mahoraga. Maybe the reason we haven't seen the wheel up until this point is because, well, he hasn't used it. But after I talked to a couple of people about this, and after looking at some things for myself, I came to the conclusion that this is probably the first time in the fight that Sukuna has used Mahoraga. And I'll go ahead and explain why. The first couple of questions that I had to look at in order to tell whether or not Sukuna has been using Mahoraga or not are these two main questions. One was, well, what has he been adapting to? And the second question is, what is it that he could be adapting to that Gojo wouldn't have noticed? Because that's the thing. Gojo knows about Mahoraga, and Gojo was wondering why Sukuna hadn't been using Mahoraga up until this point. So, if you think that Sukuna has been using Mahoraga the entire time, this means that Sukuna has been having Mahoraga adapt to certain things and Gojo was just never noticing. Well, if we look at a list of things that Mahoraga could have adapted to, we can go ahead and cross off Infinity. Infinity is still a problem for Sukuna, where he has to use domain amplification or just a domain in order to hit Gojo. But if Mahoraga adapted to it, then he would just be able to go punch Gojo without having to use domain amplification. But we know that since the start of the fight, Sukuna has had to use domain amplification in order to reach Gojo when he throws his punches. And we also can't say that Mahoraga has adapted to the limitless curse technique as a whole, because at the end of chapter 226, Sukuna gets sent flying back with a red. And he doesn't just get sent flying backwards, half of Sukuna's phase has been burnt away. But we also have to think about this. If Mahoraga has been adapting to things, wouldn't Gojo have noticed? Gojo would have had to notice that his curse techniques aren't working in a certain way, or that his curse techniques aren't affecting Sukuna how they normally have at the beginning of the fight. Also, Gojo should probably be able to see Mahoraga, or at least the wheel. So let's talk about this. Would Gojo have been able to notice a difference in his curse technique efficiency? And would he have noticed Mahoraga or the wheel being summoned at some point, or it just being there at any point during his fight with Sukuna? And we have to look at the statements that we know about the Six Eyes. Well, the first thing we know is that the Six Eyes sees through curse techniques. And at the end of this recent chapter, we see that the editor's comment is, what will those eyes see through? It's this running thing that these Six Eyes sees through everything. It sees through your own intentions. It sees through your curse techniques. So the Six Eyes would naturally be able to see through your intentions as well as your curse technique efficiency and just the basis of your curse technique and how you're using it for offense and defense. So now let's look back at what Mahoraga adapts to. Now it says that he adapts to any and all phenomena, but the reason that I think this is in reference to just any and all curse techniques is because, well, Mahoraga doesn't adapt to physical force. Mahoraga also doesn't adapt to speed. And what I mean by this is, Mahoraga just keeps getting blitzed by Sukuna as long as he's fighting him. Mahoraga is not able to adapt to Sukuna's level of speed. And we also see that anytime Sukuna puts his hand and sort of pushes and cuts Mahoraga backwards, Mahoraga always takes the physical damage. Yes, he adapts or heals from the cuts afterwards, but in that initial moment, Sukuna does get the better of him with the force and strength of his curse technique, then Mahoraga adapts afterwards. So, since Mahoraga doesn't adapt to physical force as well as speed, then I think it's safe to say that in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen, any and all phenomena means any and all abilities or any and all curse techniques. And the reason I'm sort of separating abilities and curse techniques right now is because there are some sorcerers who just use abilities that aren't curse techniques. Take Kusakabe for example. He doesn't have a curse technique, but he does have abilities like the new shadow style, which is why he reached grade 1. Okay, so now that we've established Mahoraga should only be able to adapt to these abilities and curse techniques, we have to get back to the fight with Gojo and Sukuna. All of Gojo's attacks still do damage and still work, so Mahoraga has probably not been used the entire time. We also know that, well, Gojo should be able to see if any curse technique efficiency has changed, because we know that the Six Eyes sees the intricacies of curse techniques, and they're so strong that it can even see the intentions of the person that it's fighting against. So I don't think that Mahoraga has been used this entire time, because Gojo probably would have noticed any drop-off or drop-off in efficiency in his curse technique's effects on Sukuna. So now that that's been covered, let's cover what this nosebleed is. Is this nosebleed a direct cause of Mahoraga? Because we saw that the wheel clicked as Gojo gets the nosebleed. Well, in my opinion, I don't think the two are directly correlated. I rather think that the reason Gojo is having this nosebleed goes back to something that Yuta said earlier in the fight with Sukuna. Yuta says that Gojo is pushing himself way past his limits. He compares Gojo to a car. You know how an engine can overheat, and you have to wait for the engine to cool down again before using it? Well, the way Gojo's been fighting is that whenever his engine overheats, he just uses positive energy to forcefully make it cool down quickly and then make the engine overheat again. He's doing this over and over. Yuta's exact words are, burning out a curse technique with the domain is completely different from taking physical damage. If a machine isn't broken but overheats, it won't function properly, so you have to wait for it to cool down. And Maki asks, so reverse curse technique can fix something but it can't cool it down? And Yuta says, that's what I thought, but maybe I was wrong. Or could it be Gojo may be pushing way beyond his limits? And this is exactly what Gojo has been doing in his fight with Sukuna. He truly has been pushing himself way beyond his limits. Gojo has opened up 3 domain expansions, and each time he wants to fight afterwards, he forcefully makes himself cool down by using positive energy in order to forcefully make himself cool down again so he can continue fighting. And well, what happens right before Gojo gets this nosebleed? Him and Sukuna get into another domain clash and it breaks. This is a bunch of pressure being put on Gojo's body. We know that he has his 6 eyes doing reverse curse technique around the clock on his body, so he just sort of stays fresh all the time. But what I think Yuta is talking about, and what I think that we're finally seeing with Gojo is, even though Gojo has all of these broken abilities, they are all taking place on his human physical frame. Yes, Gojo's abilities make him superhuman, but at the end of the day, Gojo is just bones and muscle and nerves just like everyone else. At some point, this physical human frame will begin to give out as long as he keeps pushing himself way past his limits. Now, at first, I didn't even think that was sort of possible, but because of the Yuta statement, combined with the fact that this is a nosebleed. Nosebleed signals some sort of internal damage, but nosebleeds can also be caused by external factors like heat. If the sun is super hot on one day, you can get a nosebleed. But in Gojo's case, this heating will be coming from all of the stress that he's putting on his body. Similar to how Yuta said an engine can overheat, Gojo's body is beginning to overheat and he is now getting a nosebleed. Okay, so now that all of that has been covered, let's get into how Mahoraga will change the direction of this fight. And the dangerous thing about Mahoraga is that when it says it can adapt to curse techniques, well, that is super dangerous, especially because we don't know the extent that Gege will take it to in this fight with Sukuna. And here's what I mean by extent. will Gege make it to where Mahoraga can adapt to the limitless curse technique as a whole? Imagine things like infinity practically being turned off. Remember how Miguel's rope or the inverted spear of heaven works, where it can just go and hit Gojo because it negates curse techniques? Can Mahoraga have a similar effect? Can it adapt to the limitless curse technique as a whole? So now Sukuna can just reach and punch Gojo with not only his fist, but with curse techniques as well, because Mahoraga would have adapted to the infinity technique. But not just this, Gege can take it a step even further by making Sukuna adapt to things like red and purple as well as blue. But that's not all that Gojo has to worry about. Remember how Sukuna had Mahoraga destroy Yorozu's domain from the outside? Well, now Sukuna could just do that to Gojo's domain, because this means that he would have adapted to Gojo's technique similar to how he adapted to Yorozu's technique during their fight. Imagine if the next time Gojo opens up his domain expansion, Sukuna just has Mahoraga simply destroy it from the outside. And the reason that this is so bad for Gojo is because, well, it looks super hard for Sukuna and Gojo to kill each other. If you've noticed, they can't really kill each other. All of their attacks that they land on each other, they just heal from. So remember the red that Gojo landed. That was the first big attack in the fight that he landed. You can say that the purple signaling the start of the fight was a good hit as well, but even that purple, a 200% purple, was only enough to knock down Sukuna to his forearm. It didn't even take Sukuna out, as Sukuna was able to just stretch out his hands and it just burned his forearms off. And then we're looking at the red that Gojo used at point blank range. You can't really get much closer than what Gojo did, and a red at this close only took off half of Sukuna's face. So you have to wonder if a 200% purple wasn't enough to take out Sukuna, and then a red at point blank range was only enough to burn off half of his face. How is Gojo going to do enough damage without domain expansion that could actually kill Sukuna? Because remember, right now we're looking for ways in which Gojo can kill Sukuna without domain expansion. Because with Mahoraga on the field, domain clashes just got a whole lot easier for Sukuna. So if Gojo loses his ability to domain clash with Sukuna because Mahoraga would just be there assisting and destroying the domain every time, is there a way for Gojo to kill Sukuna without domain expansion? And you also have to look at Sukuna's side of things. Sukuna can't kill Gojo either as far as it's looking. Yes, Sukuna still has things in his arsenal he hasn't used, but before we get into those, let's just look at what Sukuna has done so far. Even winning domain clashes hasn't been that amazing for Sukuna. Yes, they've been amazing in the sense that he gets to cut Gojo up for a bit, but at the end of the day, Gojo is just healing from them. These sure hits within a domain expansion can't even take out Gojo. And then we know that things like physical punches aren't working either. So Sukuna can't kill Gojo as far as it's looking. But there's one thing that Sukuna has that Gojo doesn't have, and that is a whole hidden arsenal that Sukuna hasn't used yet. There are things like the 9th shadow that nobody knows what it is yet. There are things like the tool that Yorozu made for Sukuna, and also Sukuna's open ability that we still haven't gotten full confirmation on what it is yet. All of these things are just things that Sukuna has but hasn't used yet, as well as the entire arsenal of the 10 shadows. He hasn't used any of the shadows so far. But as for Gojo, Gojo has used practically everything he can except for blue. He's used purple, which is what he used to signal the start of the fight. He's also used red, which he hit Sukuna point blank range with. And he's also been using the neutral limitless, which is the infinity, which has been forcing Sukuna to use domain amplification in order to reach him. But even though Sukuna has hidden things that he hasn't used yet, and Gojo has used practically everything he has, it doesn't mean that the fight is over. Yes, domain clashes might get even easier for Sukuna if he decides to have Mahoraga help him, and there is still one more thing that Gojo possibly has that he hasn't used yet the entire series, and that would be a maximum technique. In the fanbook it says, within all that, barring domain expansion, every technique has an ultimate move called the maximum. It's something different from your normal arsenal. Remember how Jogo used his maximum and it was a giant meteor that practically flattened an entire city. This ultimate move may be something that Gojo has. I mean, he should have it since it says that every technique has one. And whatever this maximum ultimate move is that Gojo has will probably be shown in this fight with Sukuna. And another thing is, we don't know if Sukuna will use Mahoraga to destroy domain expansions like he did against Yorozu. I know I've been saying that he would because it just seems like the most logical choice, but maybe in this fight with Gojo, Sukuna would think it would be more beneficial to just keep changing the conditions of his own domain to beat out Gojo's. But we saw in the recent domain clash that Gojo got the better of him, as when the domains are breaking, Sukuna ended up taking the most damage. So I have two scenarios for you. There is one in which Sukuna does not use Mahoraga in order to help him destroy Gojo's domain, and under this scenario, I think that Gojo, well, he has a great chance at actually winning the fight, because we all know that the moment Gojo wins a domain clash and his information hits Sukuna, he has practically won, which is why Sukuna was making himself be in contact with Gojo during one of their domain clashes where the information was active. If at any point Sukuna was not touching Gojo, then he would have gotten hit by the information and he probably would have lost. This is why Sukuna was forcefully putting himself on Gojo. You could even say that even though there are multiple things that Sukuna is afraid of in this fight, being hit by that information is the one thing he is truly afraid of. So I will say this, if Sukuna does not use Mahoraga in order to help him win domain clashes, then there is a good chance that Gojo will change the conditions of his domain once more and beat Sukuna in domain clash and win the fight this way. Or say if Sukuna does use Mahoraga in order to help him win domain clashes, then I think that Gojo will be contingent on using something new like a maximum technique or just a new attack in general, as his previous ones aren't working all that well. Yes, the red was good for pushing Sukuna backwards and also burning off half his face, but that's not enough to kill Sukuna, and that red was point blank range. You don't really get much closer than that. So that can't be the extent of what Gojo can do to Sukuna. Gojo will need something much more powerful in order to actually kill him. And I know that some people have also had questions about, well, why hasn't Sukuna used the 10 shadows yet? And I'm honestly not 100% sure, but if I had to say, we have to look at sort of the possibilities for why Sukuna hasn't done this yet. The first possibility will be that, well, the 10 shadows just aren't strong enough. Maybe Sukuna got in the fight with Gojo and he was like, nope, these won't be that helpful, so let me just fight with the things that I know will work. And the second possibility is that he's still scoping Gojo out. Maybe he wants to see the extent of what Gojo can do before he uses the 10 shadows so he can see when and where he should use them. But either way, we really won't know. It's sort of impossible to know exactly what's going on in that head of Sukuna's, but we also don't know when he'll use that Yorozu tool that she crafted for him, or if he will ever use some maximum technique of his own, or maybe even that open technique that he used against Jogo, because there is an entire theory about whether the open is a technique in itself where it stores other abilities, or if the open is just and only the fire. So I will say this, if Gojo's nosebleed is supposed to signify some sort of overheating on his body and he begins to slack in performance, then I think that Gojo will be in really bad trouble. But if Gojo uses something like a new technique or a maximum, or maybe even some more conditional changes to his domain expansion, or maybe even something else that Gojo comes up with on the fly, then well, Gojo has a great chance at winning this fight. And as for the Sukuna side of things, if Sukuna begins to use Mahoraga in order to help him win domain clashes, then I think that Sukuna's stocks go up as well. And if these other things like the 10 shadows technique, as well as this tool that Yorozu has crafted for him and some other things that he hasn't shown yet, then I think that it will be better for Sukuna. So if you're a Gojo fan, I'd say this to you. Don't be that worried. I will say yes, the nosebleed might be a hindrance on him because of this internal damage and physical stress he's putting on himself. But just look at everything that's happened in the fight so far. These guys are truly bending the rules of Jujutsu Kaisen. Even Gege himself said that this fight lacks common sense. So if you are a Gojo fan, I tell you to keep your head up because I have no doubt in my mind that there are still some things that Gojo hasn't shown yet. And if you are a Sukuna fan, then I don't really have much to tell you. Sukuna looks like he's in a good position right now. Yes, he took a good amount of damage at the end of this recent chapter, but I think he'll just end up healing from that like he's healed from the purple and red in the past, and Sukuna still has a bunch of things in his arsenal that he hasn't used yet. But for everybody who's listening to this video, as well as myself, we just genuinely have no idea what's going to happen next. But I will know that no matter what it is, I have trust in Gege that it will be amazing. With that being said, I want to thank you so much for reaching the end of the video. And if you enjoyed, then I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel, as I do post on different topics that you guys give me and a few that I come up with on my own. Thank you so much. See you next time.